I married my wife in the spring of 1973, and in 52 years of marriage, I have never once seen her photograph. Not a wedding picture, not a driver's license, not a snapshot at one of our children's birthdays. There's a reason for that, and the reason is the whole of what I am about to tell you. My wife stands 7 feet and 4 inches tall. Her body is covered in coarse dark hair, the color of wet cedar bark. She has never spoken a word of English in all the years I have known her, though she understands every word I say, and I have learned enough of her own way of speaking to hold a conversation by the fire on a winter night. The county clerk in Skamania County, Washington, has no record of our marriage because no clerk ever performed it. We were joined in a way older than courthouses in a clearing above the Wine River, and the only witnesses were her people and the trees. My name is Glenn Ward. I am 77 years old. I worked for 41 years as a timber faller and later a cutting foreman for a logging outfit out of Carson, Washington, in the southern Cascades. And I have spent more of my life under those Douglas firs than I have under a roof. I am telling this now because I have watched over the last 2 decades the careful and patient erasing of my wife's family from every record that a government keeps. Birth lines that go back further than the state of Washington itself scrubbed quiet. I have held the proof in my hands and watched men in clean trucks take it away. I am old and I am not afraid of much anymore. And before I go, I want one true account of this to exist somewhere that is not a filing cabinet. I want to be plain about something at the start. I am not a man who is looking for any of this. I did not go into those mountains hunting for a legend. I went into them because that is where the work was. And the work was hard and ordinary, and I was good at it. I grew up in Stevenson, the seat of Skamania County, a town pressed between the Columbia River and the steep green wall of the Cascades. My father worked the river running log rafts down to the mills, and my mother kept the books for a feed store. When I was a boy in the 1950s, the talk of something living up in the high timber was just part of the air you breathed. The old men at the store told stories about it like they told stories about hard winters and bad bosses. Nobody got worked up. The Yakima people had words for it long before my family ever came to that country, and the loggers had their own words, and everybody, more or less, left it alone. In 1969, when I was 21 and already 2 years into the woods, the county commissioners passed an ordinance that made it a crime to kill one of them. Ordinance 69-01. People outside the county laughed and called it an April Fool's joke because it passed on the 1st of April, but the chairman of the commission stood up in front of the newspaper and said it was no joke, that there was reason to believe such a thing existed and more reason to protect it. I remember reading that in the Skamania County Pioneer at my mother's kitchen table. I remember thinking the commissioners knew something. You can still look that ordinance up today. It is real, and it is still on the books, and I have my own reasons for being grateful that it is. So I did not grow up disbelieving. I grew up like people in that country grow up, which is knowing the woods are full of things that do not concern you and minding your own business and expecting the woods to mind theirs. In the fall of 1972, I was 24 years old and running a small cutting crew up the Wine River drainage north of Carson in country that climbs fast toward the flank of a mountain the maps call Trout Creek Hill. We were thinning a unit of second growth on a slope so steep we had to cable ourselves to stumps to set our chokers. It was October, and October in that drainage gets cold early, the kind of cold that sits in the bottom of your lungs and will not leave. The leaves were down off the vine maple. The river ran low and loud over its stones. My crew was 4 men, and we stayed the week in a Forest Service cabin near the bottom of the unit because the drive back to Carson on those logging roads ate 2 hours of daylight we could not spare. The first thing was the smell. I want to start there because it is the thing every account like mine gets wrong, and I will not get it wrong. People expect a stink, something foul like a dead animal. It is not that. It is a heavy, warm, living smell, musk and damp earth, and something almost sweet under it, like the inside of a barn in winter when the animals have been bedded down a long time. The first morning at that cabin, I walked out before light to start the trucks, and the smell was so thick in the cold air, I stopped on the step with the door half open. One of my men, an older faller named Roy, came out behind me and stopped the same way. He did not say anything. He just looked up the slope toward the dark timber, and then he looked at me, and we both went and started the trucks. The second thing was the woodpile. We kept a split woodpile against the cabin's north wall, stacked shoulder high, and on the third morning a section of it was knocked apart, the rounds scattered 10 and 15 feet into the brush. A bear will tear into a woodpile if there is food behind it, but there was no food, and a bear leaves claw marks and scat and a mess. This was not a mess. The rounds had been moved, set down. Some of them stood on end in the dirt in a way that looked almost deliberate, like a child had been at them. Roy crouched by the scattered wood for a long time. He had logged that country for 30 years. He told me quiet that we ought to keep the noise of the saws up during the day and stay close to the cabin at night, and that if I was smart I would not say a word about any of it to the younger two, because young men in the woods do foolish things when they get an idea in their heads. I took his advice. We finished that week and drove out, and I told myself it was bears, and I almost believed it. But the work brought me back. All through that winter and into the next year, my crew rotated through units up that same drainage, and the things did not stop. They were never loud and never close enough to see. A track in the soft mud of a skid road, 18 inches heel to toe, the toes spread and pressed deep, the print of something that walked upright and carried real weight. A run of those tracks crossing one of my own boot trails and continuing on, the stride longer than any man could walk. Knocks at night, a sound like a baseball bat swung hard against a tree trunk. One knock and then a pause and then an answer from somewhere across the canyon. Stones fist-sized landing in the brush near where we ate our lunch, never thrown to hit us, always thrown to land close like you would toss a pebble to get a friend's attention. By the summer of 1973, I had stopped telling myself it was bears. I had not told myself what it was instead. I had simply made room for it, like a man makes room for weather. There was something up that drainage. It had decided we were worth watching, and it had so far decided we were not worth harming. I was content to leave the arrangement there. What changed everything was an accident, and it was not even my accident. It was the middle of June. We were felling on a bench above the river, and one of my younger men, a kid of 19 named Wayne, miscut a leaning fir. The tree barber chaired, which is the word for when the trunk splits upward instead of falling clean, and a slab of it kicked back off the stump. It caught Wayne across the legs and threw him down the slope into a jumble of rock and slash. By the time Roy and I got down to him, he was gray in the face and his right leg was broke in 2 places below the knee, the bone pushing the skin up into a tent. We were 11 miles of bad road from the nearest pavement and another 40 from a hospital. We had no radio that reached out of that canyon. I sent the 4th man running for the trucks, and Roy stayed to splint the leg with bucked saplings and bootlaces, and I did the only thing left to do, which was to half carry that boy up the slope toward the road where the trucks could reach. I have replayed the next part more times than I can count. I had Wayne over my shoulders in a fireman's carry, and I was climbing through old slash, downed limbs crossed every which way, and my own legs were shaking. The light was going, and I came up over a wind-thrown log into a small open place in the timber, and she was standing in it. I want to slow down here because this was the first time, and a man only gets one. First time. She was perhaps 30 feet from me. She stood upright, square on 2 legs, and the top of her was higher than the low limbs of the firs around her, so that my mind kept trying to measure her against the trees and failing. 7 feet and more. Her shoulders were broad as a doorway. The hair on her was dark, near black at a distance, but I would learn it was truly a deep brown, the brown of cedar bark soaked with rain, and it lay close to her body, longer at the forearms and across the top of the back. Her face was not the face of an animal. I need you to understand that, because the word people use, the words from the cheap stories, they would put a snarling thing in your mind, and that is a lie. Her face was broad, with a heavy ridge of bone above the eyes and a wide, flat nose and a strong, low jaw, and her eyes, set deep under that ridge, were looking at me with something I knew on sight because I had seen it on the faces of men. It was judgment. She was deciding. I did not run. I want to say it was courage. It was not courage. It was the boy on my shoulders. I could not have run if I had wanted to, and somewhere in me I understood that running was the worst thing I could do, that running tells everything in the woods a certain story about you. So I stood there with Wayne's blood soaking warm through my shirt, and I looked back at her, and I did the only thing my body would let me do. I spoke to her. I do not remember the exact words. I remember the sense of them. I told her the boy was hurt, that I was trying to get him to help, that I did not mean her any trouble and never had. She tipped her head, the same way Roy's old dog would tip its head at a sound it was working out. And then she did a thing that I have spent 52 years trying to deserve. She came down the slope toward me 3 long strides, and the ground took her weight without a sound, and she reached out and lifted Wayne off my shoulders as easily as I would lift a sack of seed. And then she turned and started up the slope toward the road carrying him, and looked back once to see if I was following. I followed. God help me, I followed, and I have never stopped. She carried that boy a half-mile through slash that would have cost me an hour, and she set him down in the road within sight of my truck, gentle like you set down something you know is breakable. The other man was already there with the engine running, and then she was gone. Not run off crashing through the brush. Gone the way fog goes, stepped back into the standing timber between one breath and the next, and the woods closed up green and quiet behind her as if she had never been. We got Wayne to the hospital in White Salmon, and his leg healed, and he walked again, though he never logged again, and he never knew what carried him up that hill. Roy knew. Roy was at the road when she set the boy down. On the long drive home that night, Roy did not say one word until we hit the pavement, and then he said only this. He said, "Glenn, there are things you can tell and things you can't, and a man who can't tell the difference doesn't stay happy long." I have thought about that sentence for half a century. It was the truest piece of advice I ever got. I should have left it there, a debt, a wonder, a thing to carry quiet. But I was 25 years old, and she had looked at me and chosen, and a man who has been chosen like that cannot simply walk away. I went back. I went back alone on a Sunday with no saw and no crew, up the Wine River drainage to that bench above the river. I did not know what I meant to do. I brought food because bringing food was the only idea I had, the same dumb, hopeful idea a boy has when he wants a wildcat to like him. I brought a sack of apples and a paper of salt pork, and I set it at the edge of that little clearing where I had first seen her, and I sat down on the wind-thrown log with my back straight and my hands open on my knees, and I waited. Nothing came that first Sunday. The food was gone the next, and in its place, set on the same log, was a flat slab of honeycomb wrapped in a broad maple leaf, and beside it a fist-sized chunk of obsidian black volcanic glass napped along one edge into a working blade. I knew obsidian did not occur in that drainage. I knew it had been carried there from somewhere far off and worked by hand. I sat on that log and held the blade and understood that I was not feeding an animal. I was being answered, "I am not going to walk you through every Sunday of the next 8 months, because there were a great many of them, and the heart of it was always the same. I came, I sat, I left something and took something. The exchanges grew, a bundle of dried herbs bound with cedar bark, plants I later learned were good against fever and against pain. A length of cord twisted from some inner bark, so strong I could not break it with my hands, and I learned the rhythm of being watched without being approached, learned to feel the change in the air when she was near, a kind of pressure, a held breath in the trees. She let me see her again in the fall, a year almost to the day from the first time. It was raining, the steady gray rain of the Cascades that does not so much fall as simply occupy the air, and I was sitting on the log with my collar up when I felt the pressure change, and I looked across the clearing, and she was there at the edge of it, just inside the timber, watching the rain run off me. I did not get up. I had learned that much. I sat, and I talked to her low and easy like a man talks to settle a nervous horse, and after a long while she came out into the open and lowered herself down to sit on her heels 20 feet away, and we stayed like that, the two of us in the rain, until the light failed. I called her by a name that winter because a man cannot hold a whole part of his life in his chest without a name to fix it to. The sound she made for herself, the sound her people made when they meant her, I could not shape with my mouth, not then. It moved low, and it had a fall in the middle of it like the fall of water over a ledge. The closest I could come was to call her by the sound the river made, and so in English in my own head and later out loud I called her Wren, because of a wren that used to work the brush along that river while I sat waiting, and because the smallness of the word against the size of her made me smile, and I needed to smile in those days. She has let me call her Wren for 52 years. I think it pleases her. I cannot prove that. I have learned to read a great deal in her, but I have also learned the humility of knowing there are rooms in her I will never enter, and I have made my peace with the doors. That winter, the winter of 73 into 74, the visits changed again because she began to bring me to her instead of coming to me. The first time she simply stood at the edge of the clearing and did not sit and tipped her head up the slope and waited. I understood I was being asked to follow, and I followed, and she led me 2 miles up out of the Wren River drainage and over a low saddle into a hanging basin that no road has ever reached, a bowl of old growth so big and so quiet that the light came down through it, green as river water. There were others there. I will not pretend that first sight of the others was easy. There were 5 of them in the basin that day, and they ranged from one near as tall as Wren down to a young one no bigger than a human child of 10. And when I came over the saddle, they all went still and turned to me, and I felt the whole weight of their attention like a hand laid flat against my chest. Wren made a sound long and low with that falling note in the middle, and the largest of them, an old male gone gray across the shoulders and along the jaw, made a sound back, and the attention eased. I had been spoken for. I was, by some judgment I had not been in the room for, allowed. That is how I met my wife's family, not all of it. I would not meet all of it for years, and I have never met the whole of it because the whole of it is larger and older than I think even Wren entirely knows. But I met the heart of it that winter day in that basin. The gray old male was her father. I came in time to call him in my own head the elder, because that was the shape he held in the family, the still center the others turned toward. There was an old female I would come to think of as quietly running everything, the way the oldest woman in any family on earth quietly runs everything. There were Wren's 2 brothers, both younger than her, and the child who belonged to one of the brothers. And there was the matter of how they lived, which I had better describe now, because the cheap stories get this wrong worse than they get anything wrong. They did not live in a cave like an animal denning up. In the basin, and in 2 other places I was eventually shown, they had built shelters low and broad and strong, frames of bent living saplings and fallen limbs lashed with that bark cord, and roofed thick with slabs of bark and moss shaped to shed the rain and hold a body's warmth. They had a fire, though they used it sparingly and carefully and kept it small, and I came to understand that they kept it small on purpose, as they did everything on purpose, because smoke climbs and smoke is seen. They worked hides. They had racks of split poles where strips of meat and fish hung drying. Their tools were stone and bone and hardwood, knapped and ground and polished by hand, and there was not a scrap of metal anywhere among them, not a nail, not a wire, nothing forged. And I think now that this was not because they could not have stolen metal, but because metal was a thing of ours, and they had decided long ago and as a people to want nothing of ours. They wanted the country left as it was. They had wanted that for longer than my family had been on the continent. The thing that undid me that winter was not their strength or their size or the strangeness of them. It was their gentleness with each other. It was watching the old female pick burrs from the child's hair with fingers that could have crushed my skull, doing it slow, doing it patient, while the child squirmed and complained in its own small voice. It was the way the brothers leaned their shoulders together when they sat. It was how the elder, the gray old male, would go still and lift his head when Wren spoke and listen to his daughter the whole way through before he answered. I had grown up in a hard country among hard men, and I had been taught that gentleness was a thing you earned the right to in private and never showed in the open. And here was a people who wore it plain all the time as their ordinary way of being and were not weakened by it. I think that is the winter I stopped being a man who had met them and started being a man who loved one of them. I have skipped past the hardest thing to say, and I should not skip it because if I skip it, this is not a true account. People will want to know, and they will want to know in a way that is not kind, how a man comes to call such a one his wife. So I will say it as plainly as I am able, and then I will ask the unkind question to be set down. It was not sudden, and it was nothing forced on either side ever. It was 3 years of Sundays. It was a slow growing toward the way two trees that start close will over many years lean their crowns together until they touch. By the time I understood my own heart, the understanding was old news to my heart. Wren understood it before I did. I have asked her, in her way of speaking, in the years since, what she saw in me, a small, soft, slow thing next to her own people. And the answer she gave me, as near as I can put it into English, was that I had stood still on the slope with the hurt boy on my back when standing still cost me everything, and that her people watch above all things for what a creature does when it is afraid. They had been watching my kind do frightened things in those mountains for a long time. I had done a different thing. That was what she saw. We were joined in the spring of 1973 in the basin before the elder and the old female and the brothers. There were no words I would recognize as vows. There was a long sound the family made together, all of them, a low braided sound that I felt come up through the ground into my boots, and there was the elder taking my hand, my whole hand, lost in his, and there was Wren beside me, taller than me by a foot and a half, and entirely, in that moment, my wife. I was 25. She was, as near as I have ever been able to reckon it, a good deal older than me and would outlast me by longer than I like to think about, because her people do not age as we do, and they do not die as we do, of the years simply piling up. But that is a sorrow for the end of this account, and I am not at the end yet. I kept my life in Carson. I want to be clear about that because people imagine I vanished into the woods like a story, and I did not. I kept the cabin I rented in Carson. I kept my crew and my work. For a man to disappear is for a man to be searched for, and a search was the one thing in all the world I could not allow, because a search would not find me, it would find them. So I lived a double life, and I lived it for 52 years, and I am not going to tell you it was easy, because it gouged a loneliness in me that no one in my ordinary life could ever be allowed to see the shape of. On the books of Skamania County, I was a bachelor logger who kept to himself, who turned down the church suppers and the offers of a sister's friend's daughter, who went off alone on his Sundays and his weeks of vacation and came back rested and said nothing. In the basin, I was a husband. The two halves of me never touched, and the not touching was the price, and I paid it, and I would pay it again. Our first child was born in the basin in the winter of 1975. I was there. I had been afraid I would not be allowed to be, that this would be a thing only for the women of the family, but Wren wanted me there, and the old female permitted it. And so I sat against the bark wall of the birthing shelter through a night and most of a day while the old female and one of the brother's mates tended my wife. I have no medical learning. I could do nothing but be present, and be present I did, and near the gray light of the second morning my son was born. He was big. He was, I would guess, near 12 pounds, and he came into the world already looking, the dark eyes open and moving, and he did not cry like a human infant cries. He made a low sound, a small version of the falling note, and the whole family answered him from outside the shelter, a soft chorus of it welcoming him, and I sat there with my back against the bark and wept like the young fool I was. He was made of both of us. That was plain from the first hour, and it never stopped being the truest thing about him. He had Wren's heavy build and the cap of fine dark hair across his shoulders and back, and he had a strength in his small hands that startled me when he closed them on my finger, but he had my mother's gray eyes. He had a narrowness through the face that was mine and not Wren's. He was warm to hold like Wren is warm, a deep furnace warmth that her whole people carry, but he was not as warm as she is, as though the fire in him had been banked a little by my side of the line. We named him together, Wren and I, which is to say, Wren gave him a sound from her people, and I gave him a word from mine, and the word I gave him was Asa, because it was my own grandfather's name, and it was short and old and strong, and a hybrid child of two worlds ought to carry one foot planted firmly in each. I have to tell you about Asa's growing, because Asa's growing is the first thread of the thing that the government would later pull and pull and pull until they had unraveled my wife's family right out of the records of the world. Asa grew fast, faster than a human child, though not as fast as a full child of Wren's people. By what would have been a human 2 years, he had the body and the sureness of a human boy of 5 or 6, and he could already move through that old growth with a quiet I have never learned, placing his broad, bare feet without looking at them, reading the ground like I read a printed page. He could hear things I could not. He could smell a person, by which I mean one of my kind, a half-mile off and downwind, and tell me whether it was a man or a woman and how afraid they were. His eyes took the dark the way an owl's do. And here's the thing I have to make you understand, because it is the whole quiet tragedy at the center of this. Asa was a person, not a specimen, not a wonder, not a discovery, a boy. He was curious past all bearing, always at me with questions. Why does the river sound different in the cold? Why do my kind cut the trees? What is on the far side of the mountain? What is the white trail the jet leaves on the sky? He laughed. He had a laugh that started low in his chest. That falling note turned happy, and it could undo me where I stood. He loved his mother past speaking, and he was a little shy of his grandfather, the elder, and he tormented his uncles the way all small boys torment their uncles everywhere on the earth. He learned both ways of speaking, his mother's and mine, and by what would have been 6 years old and a human child, he spoke to me in English in a low, rough, careful voice, picking the words like a man picking his footing on wet stone, and he spoke to his mother's people in their braided falling speech far better and faster than I ever would. I taught him to read. I want that written down. I carried books up that drainage in my pack, a few at a time, wrapped in oilcloth against the rain, and I taught my hybrid son to read sitting on a log in a basin no map shows, and he took to it like he took to everything, fast and deep and joyful. By the time he was what I would call 10, he had read every book I owned, some of them 3 and 4 times, and he was asking me for more, and he was asking me harder questions than I could answer. We had 3 more children after Asa, a daughter in 1978 whom we named June, a son in 1982 whom we named Vernon after no one, just a good plain old name I liked, and our last, a daughter, in 1986, and her we named Ruth. 4 children. Each of them made of both worlds, and each of them made of it a little differently, the way any 4 children of any couple come out 4 different people. June was the most like her mother, tall, early, and quiet and watchful, with the deepest furnace warmth of any of them. Vernon was the most like me, the narrowest in the face, the lightest in his hair, the one a stranger seeing him at dusk and at a distance might almost have taken for an unusually big human man. Ruth was somewhere in the middle and was, from her first year, the cleverest of the 4, the one whose questions had questions inside them. For a long stretch of years, through the late 70s and most of the 80s, I had what I can only call a happy life, even cut in 2 as it was. The work went well, the family in the basin grew, because Wren's brothers had children of their own, and the children I had helped welcome had cousins, and the basin in summer was full of young ones and their noise. I had a wife I loved past all sense and 4 children who knew me and ran to me when I came over the saddle. The loneliness of the Carson half of my life was a real thing, and I will not pretend it away, but a man can carry a great deal of loneliness if the other side of the scale is loaded heavy enough, and mine was. I thought it could go on. That was my mistake, if it was a mistake, and I have decided in my old age that it was not a mistake so much as a mercy, because a man cannot live happy while bracing every hour for the blow. I let myself believe the arrangement could simply continue, the two halves of my life running side by side down the years and never crossing. The blow, when it came, came like they always come, from a direction I was not watching. It was the autumn of 1988. Asa was 13 by the count of years, though in the size and steadiness of him he was nearer a young man, and he had begun, the way young ones of his mother's people do, to range, to go off from the family for days at a stretch, up into the high country, learning the wider country like I had once learned a logging unit. Wren did not fear it. It was the way of her people. The young ones ranged, and they came back, and the ranging made them. That October, Asa came back from a range of 4 days, and he came back changed, and he came back carrying something, and the something he carried was the beginning of the end of the world, as my family had known it. He had gone further north and west than he had ever gone, up onto the high benches under the old volcano, the mountain that had torn itself open in 1980 and was still 8 years on, a gray and steaming ruin ringed with downed timber. And up there in that broken country where almost no person of my kind had reason to go, Asa had found a thing that did not belong. He led me to it himself a week later because he had told his mother, and his mother had told me to be shown, and the 4 of us, Asa and Wren and I and the elder, climbed for the better part of a day to a bench of ground above a creek. It was a camp, not a logging camp and not a hunter's camp. It was small, and it was neat, and it was clearly meant not to be found. There were the remains of a fire pit lined with stones. There were the cut and peeled stubs where someone had taken saplings for some frame or rack, and driven into the ground at the 4 corners of the cleared place were stakes, and the stakes were metal. And to the metal stakes was fixed a kind of fine mesh fencing, knee-high, the sort of thing you would use to pin something small or to mark a square of ground you meant to come back to and study. And there was a box. A weatherproof case of green plastic the size of a footlocker, half buried under a cairn of rock and brush so that you would walk past it 10 times and never see it. Asa had not walked past it. Asa could smell the man smell on it from down the slope. He had dug it out, and he had carried it, and now he set it down in front of me on that bench, and I knelt down in the cold and worked the latches, and I looked inside, and I felt the floor of my life tilt. There were cameras in that box. Not the cameras a man of 1988 would carry to take a picture. These were squat olive drab things with lenses like dark eyes and bundled wire and a kind of beam trip rig I half recognized, and I understood I was looking at a trail camera, an automatic camera of a make and quality no hunter and no logger I had ever known could afford. There were sample tubes, glass and capped, some of them holding twists of dark hair, some of them holding I could not tell what. There was a stack of waterproof paper, printed and gridded, and a great deal of it was filled in by hand in a small, neat, back-slanted writing, and what was filled in were dates and map coordinates and columns of measurements, and there was a folder, and in the folder were photographs, and the photographs were of my family. They were not good photographs. They were the gray, grainy kind that a machine takes by itself in poor light. But I had been looking at these faces for 15 years, and I knew them. There was the elder, gray across the shoulders, caught mid-stride at the edge of a meadow. There was one of Wren's brothers. There was a long-range shot, badly blurred, of 3 figures at a tree line, and one of the 3 was small, and the small one was my son June's age, and I will not tell you it was June, because I could not be certain, and I have spent 37 years not letting myself be certain. And clipped to the inside of the folder was a single sheet of heavier paper, a kind of cover page, and across the top of it was printed a string of letters and numbers, a project code, and a word I did not know, and beneath that smaller the words that have never since left me. They read, Relocation and Population Control Assessment. I knelt on that cold bench with that page in my hand and my 13-year-old son standing over me, and the elder, my wife's gray old father, came and stood beside me and looked down at the page he could not read and looked at me, and I had to find a way, in his daughter's falling speech and with my poor command of it, to tell that old man what the page meant. Relocation, population control. I did not have the words for it in his language. I am not sure his language has the words for it because I am not sure his people ever needed to invent them. I told him, as near as I could, that men of my kind had found this country, his family's country, and had begun in secret to count his people and to measure them and to make a plan for them. The elder did not make a sound. He took the green box from me, the whole of it, the cameras and the tubes and the gridded paper, and he carried it to the edge of the bench where the creek ran loud below, and he did not throw it down. He set it down, carefully, and then he stood looking out over his country, the broken gray miles of it under the ruined mountain, for a long, long time, and I have never before or since seen a sorrow sit on anyone the way it sat on him, and I have seen a great many sorrows. That was the day my family's long peace ended. That was the day I learned that we were being erased, though I did not yet know the word erase, and did not yet know how thorough and how patient and how quiet the erasing would be. I knew only that there was a project, and the project had a code, and the project had a plan, and the plan had my children's faces clipped inside its folder. I want to tell you what we did with that green box because it matters and because the choice we made that autumn shaped everything that came after. We did not destroy it. The elder would not have it destroyed, and the longer I have lived, the more I have understood the wisdom in that old man that I was too frightened that October to see. To destroy the box was to make whoever owned it certain that something in those mountains could find a hidden thing and meant it harm. To destroy the box was to start a war, and the elder knew, the way he knew the weather, that his people could not win a war against mine. There were too few of them and too many of us, and our reach was too long. So we did not destroy it. We did something stranger, and I think now far cleverer. We moved it. Asa and his uncles carried that box 11 miles south and east down out of the high broken country, and they buried it again, latched and whole and untouched under a cairn of rock on a bench above a different creek in a drainage where no member of the family had set foot in 2 years and did not intend to. They left it for its owners to find right where it was, full of true dates and true measurements of a place the family had simply quietly and forever walked away from. And then the whole family, every shelter, every drying rack, every soul moved. They abandoned the basin under the old volcano, the basin where all four of my children had been born, and they went south, deeper into the Wine River country, and then beyond it, into folds of the southern Cascades that I will not name even now, even with everyone who could be hurt by my naming them most likely past hurting. It half broke my wife to leave that basin. I know it did, though her people do not show such things the way mine do. I helped them move. For 2 months in the back end of 1988, I worked every hour I was not logging, carrying what could be carried, and I learned in those 2 months exactly how good my wife's people were at the one thing they had been practicing as a people for longer than my country had existed. They were good at not being found. They moved like water moves, leaving the ground behind them looking like no one had ever passed. The elder had a genius for it. I came to understand that autumn that the reason the world had been able to call my wife's people a legend for 200 years was not that they were few and was not that the country was big, though both those things were true. It was that they had made a decision as a people somewhere back in the dark of time, and the decision was this: we will not be found because the ones who would find us cannot be trusted, and we will pay any price in hardship and exile and grief to keep that true. They had been paying that price for centuries before I was born. In the autumn of 1988, I watched them pay it again, and I watched my wife pay her share of it, and I have never since heard a person call them animals without feeling the word as a kind of blow. The move nearly cost us, and I have not told this part to anyone, and I am going to tell it now because it is the truest measure I have of what those years did to my family. It was December. The family was strung out across 11 miles of hard country, moving in small groups the way the elder ordered it so that no single track ever held more than 2 or 3 of them at once. Ruth, my youngest, was 2 years old. She had a fever, I do not know what kind. Her mother's people do not sicken the way mine do. They are hard and healthy people, but the children of a mixed line are their own thing, and Ruth had taken something into her small body that would not let go of her, and on the third night of the move, her breathing went wrong. I have sat with sick children. I knew the sound. It was the sound that empties a father out, and I could do nothing because there was nothing of my world I could reach. I could not carry a feverish hybrid child into the emergency room in White Salmon. I could not drive her to a doctor in Hood River. The moment I did, my daughter stopped being my daughter and became a thing on a steel table with a folder of her own, and the folder would have her mother's face in it inside a week. I knew that with total clarity, kneeling in the snow with my child laboring for breath against my chest, and the knowing was the worst thing I have ever carried, and I have carried this whole account, so understand what I am saying. It was the old female who saved her. Wren's people had no metal and no medicines from a bottle, but they had something my world has been throwing away with both hands for 200 years, which is the deep and exact knowledge of what grows in a particular country and what it is good for. The old female sent one of the brothers down through the snow in the dark to a south-facing slope she named, and he came back before dawn with the inner bark of a certain tree and a root I never did learn the name of, and she made of them a thing that was part steam and part bitter tea, and she worked over my daughter through the rest of that night and the whole of the next day, and on the second dawn Ruth's breathing came back even and her fever broke, and she opened her eyes and asked in her mother's speech for something to eat. The old female did not look at me in triumph. She looked tired, and she looked at Ruth the way the oldest woman in any family looks at a child pulled back from an edge, and then she went to lie down. I have thought many times since about what would be lost from the world if my wife's people were ever finally found and counted and relocated into some managed and studied remnant. It is not their height that would be lost, or the wonder of them. It is the old female on a south slope in the dark, knowing exactly which tree. We finished the move. The family came to rest by the middle of that winter in new country, and they began again. New shelters, new drying racks, the patient rebuilding of a life. And I want to be honest about what that did to them across the years, because the cheap stories would have it that a people like Wrens simply melt into the wilderness and want for nothing. That is not the truth. The truth is that the country they could safely use got smaller every decade, and a smaller country is a harder country. The good low basins with the salmon and the easy winters were the first to get roads and gates and cameras, and so the family was pushed higher onto thinner ground into longer winters. I watched the family I had married into spend 40 years being slowly, politely, and without one drop of spilled blood squeezed. Not hunted, squeezed. There is a kind of harm that never raises its voice, and I have watched it work on the people I love for most of my life, and it is the patience of it that I cannot forgive. I have to step back now and tell you the part of this that I learned slowly over years in pieces, the part that explains the word I have used and not yet earned. The word is erased. After the green box, I could not let it alone. I had to know who. A project has owners. A code printed on a cover sheet means a file exists somewhere with that code on its spine. I was a logger with a 10th grade education and no idea how a man even begins to pull on such a thread, but I was also a man whose children's faces were in that folder, and that makes a person resourceful. I started where a logger can start, which is with land. I had spent my whole working life on Forest Service ground and Bureau of Land Management ground, and I knew, the way men in my trade know, that the agencies were always closing roads and trading parcels and redrawing the lines of what could be entered and what could not. So through the late 80s and into the 90s, I began quietly to pay attention to a thing I had always ignored, which was the paper, the maps. Which drainages got their roads decommissioned and gated, which sections got pulled out of timber sale plans at the last hour for reasons that were given in language too smooth to hold a fact. And I began to see a pattern, and the pattern made the hair stand up on my arms because the pattern was the country my wife's people used. Not roughly, closely. The high benches, the hanging basins, the drainages with the hardest access. One by one across those years, they were being quietly, reasonably, and permanently closed. Roadless, protected, withdrawn, always for a name good reason, an owl, a fish, a fragile soil, a cultural site. And I do not doubt the owls and the fish were real. But I had knelt on a bench under the volcano with a folder in my hands, and I knew that under the named reasons ran another reason, unnamed, and the unnamed reason was a project with a code. I will tell you the single hardest thing I learned, and then I will tell you how I learned the rest of it, and then I will bring this account home because I am an old man and I have been talking a long time, and the heart of it is close now. The hardest thing I learned was about the records. I told you at the very start of this account that the county clerk has no record of my marriage. That is true, and that is ordinary, because no clerk married us. But here is the thing that is not ordinary, the thing that took me 20 years to see the whole of. My wife's people are not new. They did not arrive. They have been in these mountains the whole time alongside my kind, for the entire span that my kind has kept paper in this country, and for a long age before that. And for parts of that span, they were known, not as a legend, known. I have spent years of my Sundays, the Sundays I did not spend in the high country, in the basements of small historical societies and county libraries from the Columbia Gorge to the Canadian line, an old logger with reading glasses and a notebook, and I have found them. A line in a fur company's ledger from the 1820s, a clerk's note about a trade with tall, hair-covered people of the high valleys, the kind of note a clerk writes plain because he has not yet been told the thing is impossible. A homestead claim from the 1890s in a drainage I know, the file thin, the proving up papers strangely incomplete, a wife listed by a first name only, and no origin given and no death record ever filed. A page from the minute book of a county commission from 1911, a hearing on a petition about, quote, the hill people, end quote, and then the next 3 pages of that minute book cut out clean with a blade. That is the erasing. It is not loud. There is no fire, no raid, no van. It is a clerk somewhere being told that a certain old file is to be pulled for preservation and never quite returned. It is a microfilm reel that skips. It is a homestead wife with no maiden name. It is 3 pages cut from a minute book with a blade so sharp the cut is hard to see. It is patient and it is bloodless. And it has been going on, I have come to believe, for the better part of 150 years. And its purpose is not to kill my wife's people. Its purpose is to make sure that when my kind finally fully arrives in those last basins with our cameras and our sample tubes and our cover sheets, there will be no old paper anywhere to say that the thing we have found was ever known, was ever neighbor, was ever anything, but a discovery to be assessed, relocated, and controlled. I learned the rest of it from a man, and I will not give you his name, because he is most likely dead now. And even dead, I owe him better. I met him in the middle 90s. He was a retired wildlife biologist, a federal man, and he had spent a career in the Cascades, and he had a tremor in his hands and a great deal he wanted to set down before he could not. We came together like 2 men with the same dangerous knowledge, sometimes find each other slantwise through a third person with a great deal of careful talking around the edges before either of us said a true thing plain. But we got there. I told him about a green box. His hands went still on the table when I said it, And then he told me what he knew, and what he knew lined up with my maps like a key lines up with a lock. He told me there was no grand conspiracy, no secret room, no one villain, and I have come to believe he was right, and that the truth is worse than a villain. He told me it was a habit, a bureaucratic habit, old and self-renewing, in which a small number of people at a time, each of them believing they were being responsible, each of them believing they were preventing a panic or protecting a fragile thing from a stampede of the curious, made the quiet choice to keep it quiet, to withdraw the land, to classify the file, to fund the assessment, but never the announcement. He told me the trail cameras under the volcano were real and were one of several efforts, and that the efforts were not coordinated so much as they were repeated. Each generation of careful men picking up the same habit from the last and passing it on. And he told me the word that had been on my cover sheet, relocation, was a real and serious word to those men, that there were people who genuinely believed the kindest end of the story was a managed one, a finding, a protected enclosure, a controlled and studied and labeled remnant. He said it the way a man says a thing he is ashamed to have ever sat in a room with. And I thought of the elder setting that green box down so gently at the edge of the creek, and I understood that my wife's father had read those men correctly from a single folder without a word of English in about 4 minutes on a cold bench in 1988. He told me one more thing near the end of the last afternoon we ever spent together, and I have turned it over more than anything else he gave me. I asked him why. Not why the habit, I understood the habit by then. I asked him why him. Why a man who had given his working life to that agency would sit across a diner table from a stranger and hand him the keys to it. He was quiet a while. Then he said that in 1971, his first season, a young man green as spring, he had been part of a survey crew on a ridge up the Lewis River, and that one evening at dusk he had walked away from the others to set a stake, and that he had come around a rock and stood for the space of perhaps 4 breaths 6 feet from one of them. A big one, he said, a big one with gray across the shoulders. And the big one had not run and had not raised a hand, had only looked at him, he said, with a look he had spent the next 30 years of paperwork trying and failing to file under anything, and then had stepped back into the timber and was gone. He said he had never reported it. He said he had spent his whole career inside the machine that was erasing the thing he had seen, doing his small, honest pieces of that machine's work, telling himself, like every man in it told himself, that the quiet was a kindness. And he said that now he was old and his hands shook, and he had decided that the look that big gray one had given him on the ridge in 1971 had been all along a question, and that he did not want to die without having finally answered it. I have never forgotten that. I have come to think that a great many of the people who turned the screws on my wife's family across those years had each, somewhere, been handed that same look and had each found a way to set it down. The biologist was the only one I ever met who picked it back up. So now you know what I have watched. I have watched, across 52 years, a careful and unhurried machine go about the business of making sure my wife's family can be called a discovery instead of a neighbor when the discovering is finally done. I have watched the roads close in around the country they need. I have watched the old paper that proved they were always here go missing a page and a reel and a file at a time. And I have understood slowly that I am one of the few people alive who has seen both ends of it, the cut pages in the basement and the gray faces in the folder, and known they were the same hand. There was one year I came near to losing all of it, and I will set it down because a true account does not get to keep only its proud parts. It was 2009. I was 61 and still working, foreman now, not falling much myself. A timber company surveyor, a careful young fellow doing his job exactly right, ran a line through a drainage well south of the Wren River into country the family had been using for 6 or 7 years, and he found a thing my wife's people had grown a little careless about because no one had walked that ground in a human lifetime. He found a shelter, an old one, a winter shelter, The family had not used in 2 seasons, the sapling frame of it gone gray, but the shape of it unmistakable, and around it the worked stumps and a bone scraper dropped in the duff and a fire ring of stones. He photographed it. He was not a fool and he was not a believer. He simply logged what he found like a good surveyor logs everything, and his photographs and his notes went into his company's file, and his company's file, because the parcel touched federal ground, went where such things go. I heard about it because I still had my ear to the paper, and the paper that year had a small ripple in it, a sudden, unscheduled withdrawal of 3 sections in that exact drainage, a closure written in the smooth language that I had long since learned to read as a wound, and I knew. The way you know a tree is going to come down wrong, that somewhere a green box was about to go up into that country. I did the only thing I could. I went to the family and I told them, and they moved again. Again. The family that had buried 4 of my children in a basin under a volcano and been driven out of it. The family that had carried a feverish Ruth 11 miles through December snow. Packed up one more time in their 60s and 70s and 80s of years and went deeper into harder ground, and I helped them do it. And I was old enough that year that the helping cost me something it had not cost me at 30. We were not found. The careful young surveyor never knew that his correct and honest day's work had set an 80-year-old people walking through snow. The withdrawal went through, the cameras went up, I have no doubt, in a drainage that by then held nothing but an old gray shelter frame in the wind. The machine assessed an empty place and wrote its empty numbers down, but it had been close that year. It had been a matter of weeks, and I understood, lying awake after, that the squeezing had a bottom to it, that there is only so much higher and harder a people can be pushed before there is no further to go, and that I would likely not live to see that bottom reached, but that my children would, and their children, and that this was the thing above all others I needed to get said while I still could. I did one thing about it, and it is the reason I am telling you all of this, and then I am nearly done. I kept my own record for 52 years. I have kept a record, and unlike the records of the government, mine was kept to be found. I have a journal, many journals now, oilcloth wrapped, and they hold every date and every measurement and every map I dared to draw, though I have been careful, even here, even now, to draw no map that leads anyone to a living soul. I have the obsidian blade Wren left me on a log in 1973. I have a coil of that bark cord no man can break. I have a cast I took in plaster of the elder's footprint, 18 1/4 inches, the dermal ridges in it plain as the lines in my own palm. I have, pressed in the back of my oldest journal, a few coarse dark hairs from my wife's shoulder, given freely, and I have a letter from a laboratory, paid for in cash under a name that was not mine, that says the hairs carry no medulla pattern on record, that they are not human and not bear and not elk and not anything the man writing the letter could name, and that he would be glad to know where I had got them, and I never wrote him back. I have copies, photographs of pages of a fur ledger and a homestead file and a county minute book with 3 pages cut out. And I have my children, and my children have children now, and the youngest of my grandchildren has just enough of the old blood in her to run warm and hear far and love the timber, and just enough of mine to walk unremarked down the main street of Stevenson, and that braiding of the 2 lines down through the years is a record too, the only kind that cannot be cut from a book with a blade. Asa is 50 now. He ranges a country I have never seen, and he comes back to his mother still, and he reads. My God, how he reads. And the last time I saw him, he asked me a question I could not answer, which is how I have always known him. June has children of her own. Vernon, my Vernon, the one who took the most of me, comes down out of the high country 2 or 3 times a year and meets me on a certain logging spur at dusk, and we sit in the cab of my truck, my huge, gentle son folded into a space too small for him, and we do not say very much, and it is the finest few hours of whatever month they fall in. Ruth, My clever Ruth, my youngest, is the one who carries the family's memory now, the one the others tell things to, so that the things will be kept. And she has told me in her mother's falling speech that when I am gone, she will keep this account of mine the way she keeps the rest, and I believe her, and it is a great comfort. Wren is beside me as often as the shape of my two lives allows. We are old together now, in the way each of us is old, which is not the same way, and that is the grief I said I would come to, and here it is. I am 77, and I am near the end of my road, and Wren is not near the end of hers, not by a long measure, and one of the last hard things I have had to learn to carry is that I will leave her, and leave her with a great many years to go on without me, and that there is nothing in either of our worlds to be done about it. We have spoken of it in our way. She has told me, as near as I can carry it into English, that she does not count a life by its length, that her people do not, that they count it by whether it was lived true. By that counting, she has said, ours has been a long life and a good one. I hold to that. On the bad nights, I hold to it hard. I am telling this now and telling it to be found for one reason above all the others, and I will end on it. I have spent 52 years being the only man at a certain table, the only one who has sat at a winter fire with the elder and also stood in a county basement holding a minute book with the pages cut out. And the thing I have learned, the one thing I would hand to whoever is hearing this, is that the people in those mountains are not a monster and are not a marvel. They are a family. They are a quiet, ancient, gentle, watchful family who made one hard decision a long time ago to stay hidden because they had taken our measure and found that they could not afford to be found by us. They have kept that decision at a terrible cost, and they keep it still. And every closed road and every missing file is one more turn of the screw that proves their old judgment of us was sound. I married into that family. I have buried in my heart the knowledge that the world they have to leave my children is smaller every year. But I have also held my newborn son in a basin no map shows and heard a whole people sing him welcome. And I have been chosen on a slope with a hurt boy on my back by a creature who judged me and did not find me wanting. I would not trade 1 hour of it, not one. Not the lonely Carson nights, not the cut pages, not the snow of the moves. A man does not get to keep only the easy half of a thing he loves, and I never wanted to. My name is Glenn Ward. My wife's name, the name I gave her because I could not shape her own, is Wren. We have been married 52 years. She is real, and our children are real, and the family she comes from has been a neighbor to this country since long before there was a country here to be a neighbor of. Someone erased the paper that said so. I am only one old logger, and this is only one account, and a blade can cut 3 pages out of a minute book in under a minute. But it cannot cut this. Not now, not anymore. It is said, and it is true, and it is out where it cannot be unsaid. The mountains are not empty. They never were. And the family that lives in them is waiting, with a patience I cannot teach you and can only describe to find out whether we were ever worth being found by.